Our host, Dr. David Anfam, is the Managing Director of Art Exploration Consultancy, as well as the Senior Consulting Curator and Research Director at Clyfford Still Museum in Denver. His focus is on modern and contemporary American art, and since 1990, he has contributed essays to more than 70 exhibition catalogs. Dr. Anfam is also the author of Abstract Expressionism, Mark Rothko, The Works on Canvas, and Anish Kapoor. Our guest today, Ali Banisadr, was born in Tehran, Iran, and currently lives and works in Brooklyn. He graduated from SVA in 2005 with a degree in fine arts, and from the New York Academy of Art in 2007 with an MFA. Since his first solo exhibition in 2008, Banisadr has exhibited in the US and abroad. His densely populated paintings are influenced by his childhood experiences of the Iran-Iraq War, as well as synesthesia. And now I will hand it off to you, David, to take it away.
Thank you very, very much, Catherine. This is London calling, everybody. And it's impossible to start without mentioning that we're living through very, very dark global times. And it's precisely because of that that I want to begin on a very trivial, personal, and anecdotal note. The last 5 weeks or so of lockdown have been absolutely terrible. And I've got to keep the sanity. And I've got quite depressed at times, but two things have cheered me up. The first is I looked at our flyer, and there's Fong's very wonderful drawing of me in 2009. As you can imagine, in London, all the barber shops are closed down, so I've had to go back to doing something that I didn't do for years, is cutting my own hair. And looking at Fong's drawing, and then looking at myself in the mirror in the bathroom this morning, I'm delighted to see I've got just as much hair as I had 11 years ago. So that cheered me up a bit. The second bit of good news from London is that I found out yesterday that Ali and I have got something in common, and you'll never guess what it is. The ink spots. And Americans of a certain age, and Ali is up there pointing it out, we both love the ink spots, and that's a good way to start. Now, art is always a very serious matter, so I really want to get down to that. Could we have the first slide, please? And Ali, you chose all of the images of your own work, which I'm looking at now. And the first two are two paintings of 2007. And could you tell me, first of all, why you titled them Black?
Can we actually have it so it's like a image? Because right now it looks a bit strange. It's like we could see the whole, like, does anyone know how to do it?
Don't ask me, I'm not a techie type.
Yeah. So like we just see the image itself and not all the, I think you have to have it as like a slideshow or something.
We're working on getting that to happen. So we'll work on that in the background while you continue, maybe?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so these works are, wow, they're from 13 years ago.
Right.
Which is a bit crazy to think about. But I think, so these works are like a beginning of the current work that I'm making now. They're like sort of like the foundation where I decided to make work that were based on sound. And it sort of happened, it actually happened with some charcoal drawings that I made, where I kind of like just let go of trying to create forms using references and just basically like using sound as a starting point and without any references. And the results were quite satisfying to me because I felt like they felt more real than what I was making before. They just felt instant, and they felt like the symbols and the end result just felt like I could feel it intuitively in a deep way, like it communicated with me right away. So yeah, there are two paintings that are called Black.
Could we have a second one, please, so we can see the difference between them? One's a vertical format. The second one, please.
We're getting there. 1 second.
No, we're on number one at the moment.
Also, you know,
I'm just pulling it up. So
I can't change it from my side, can I?
Yeah, we're just gonna switch who's sharing screen really quick. Just one moment.
Right. That's getting better, yeah.
yeah, give me 1 second here.
oh, there we go. Nice.
So
Cool. Yep.
Yeah, that's better. I personally interpret the two paintings, Black and Black 2. The first one we saw, it struck me that it was a kind of Fall of the Damned. Does that make sense, Ali?
Yep, it does. I think it had some reference. The first one had maybe some reference to 9.
Something very interesting, and this is 13 years ago, but it's continued throughout your work, is this fascinating razor's edge balance between figuration and abstraction. And that, to me, is what I found hypnotic when I first encountered your work. Is that what you've always been aiming for?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't personally, I mean, I didn't see it within those categorization. I saw it like, I always liked when things were in this between space, you know, like the way your memory works, the way imagination works, the way dreams works, the way hallucination works. I was always interested in this space where things are in the middle of transforming into something else. And how do you capture that? How do you capture this sort of like untangible thing where you see images in your mind and you're trying to catch it, and you as soon as you catch it, it sort of slips out of your hands. And I think this was always interesting to me, this idea. And for this reason, before I went to art school, I was taking a lot of psychology classes because I was always interested in this idea of the subconscious, and reading a lot of Jung and trying to understand why am I interested in this between space, and what can I do about it? How could I make something that sort of shows this interest? And I think with these two paintings, you have one that's like more shifted towards the figurative side, and then you have this one, Black 2, which is more shifted towards the abstract side, but it still kind of has the same type of energy going within the painting, with this all-overness, sort of no center, but like everything is just sort of this all-over composition.
My impression is that there's very finely tuned equilibrium between what you just called energy and what I would call entropy.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting sense of order and disorder, and it's kind of kept in a balance in a way which very much reminds me of Jackson Pollock, a completely different artist to yourself. But also, you know, he wrote notes in 1950 where he mentioned energy and motion made visible, memories arrested in space, states of order. And I think we'll see a bit further down a painting which is titled, in a sense, in that kind of framework.
Yeah, I mean, he
yeah.
talked about energy a lot, and he talked about you know, sort of going into a trance state like a shaman does, and trying to sort of capture that energy, you know. And I think I'm interested in that.
Do you think it would be fair to characterize them? If I was writing again, I would say that they're maelstroms of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make any sense? Good. Good. Could we have a next image, please? Again, the titles are far from irrelevant, but there's always a danger of reading too much back into the image from the title. But when I saw this painting, it was impossible not to think of the deep water BP oil spill of exactly 2010.
Yes.
And is that something that was maybe in your mind?
Absolutely. Especially because they had a lot of interest in Middle East. But I mean, I think my titles, I mean, we were talking about titles a few days ago with you, and you were asking me if the titles are important, and they're always very important, because for me, it sort of embodies, like, I mean, I'm always having a hard time. I'm always overwhelmed with information that I'm after. I mean, you should look at like my studio or my notebooks. It's just like one thing leads to another thing, and like I read one thing, and then that leads me to something else, and then something else, and I become overwhelmed because I want to be able to capture all these things and make sense out of them, and therefore the painting becomes like the concentration of all these things where I'm putting them there, and daily I'm coming in and sort of thinking about those things and trying to somehow combine them together and make sense out of them. So like the titles definitely refer to certain things that are like, you know, current events, but at the same time, like I never want them to be read just as like I'm portraying or illustrating those particular things, because I think there's also, I'm referencing art history, and I'm referencing my personal history, and referencing like many other things. But among all those things, Blackwater, yes, it was referring to those mercenaries in a way. And I got to kind of talk about the process of this particular work, because it's very different. That's why it's called etching painting, because it's very different than all my other works. This is actually like oil on panel, but the way these figures come out is I use an etching needle, and I sort of kind of go about it as if I'm like doing an etching. And that's by scratching away little by little. Like if you see it in person or details, like everything is sort of like scratch with the etching needle to have these images emerge.
So from here onwards, I think it's fair to describe the paintings as a mixture of additive paint and then subtractive paint. And I guess obviously the idea of subtracting paint, we see it actually, the obvious artist who does that the most is Mark Tansey. And you know,
yes,
the whole image is built up in that way. But the other obvious, very clear precedent is Max Ernst. And I think you're a big fan of Max Ernst, aren't you?
I am a big fan of Max Ernst, my favorite surrealists.
It was pretty good. It was pretty good. But he had a dark vision. You remember, you know, One Night of Love? I mean, when Ernst had a retrospective at the Met, I don't know how long ago it was.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, quite a while ago, but there was One Night of Love, which is a very, very somber, almost demonic painting. And then later you've got the forests, which are actually, there's a touch of the forests in your work, this sense of a very, very compressed goings on, which you can half see and half not see. And this is where the light and shade become very, very important. I like the way you've managed to be very up to date, because what I'm going to say when we see the next slide, if we could please. You see, you look at this, and I did a bit of homework. I've forgotten about this painting, Favashi, and that title. It had me baffled, but I did some homework, and I gather that that is an Indo-Iranian word. Am I right?
Yeah, it's so this work was commissioned for for a show at Venice Biennial that revolved around Azerbaijan and its neighbor countries, and they wanted. I thought maybe I wanted to come up with something that like all these countries historically shared, and I'm always interested with this whole idea of ancient and contemporary at the same time. Like I like this balance of ancient and contemporary. So in Zoroastrian religion, which is like the pre-Abrahamic religion that all these countries shared together, Farvashi was a symbol of light and fire, which is the most important symbol for Zoroastrians. So I thought maybe I'll dive into that and make this is my first triptych that I made. Yeah.
Even when you get brighter, as opposed to black water, here we've got a very, it's almost confetti-like effect of a huge amount going on. Even then, there's definitely something, I'm not sure if tragic is the right word, but there's something cataclysmic about most of your paintings. And that is another factor I was very much drawn to. You managed to pack in a hell of a lot, quite literally. I mean, when I visited your studio on the 14th of April, 2018, it was like, it's wonderful going into artist studios because they're their sanctum sanctorum, and there, if you're careful and they don't mind you looking, you can start to read their minds. And I remember there were all sorts of images around the room, and there was a Blake reproduction and other artists like that. And before I actually met you, I wasn't sure if I was going to get on with you at all. But once I got to Clinton Hill, is it? Classen Avenue?
Clinton.
On the Street Line. Once I got there, once I met you, I thought, well, this guy really knows his stuff. He knows his art history, but he's also very much up to a minute with what I call the space of cyberspace. It's a space where things are constantly interacting. It's a new kind of space, and I've seen it again and again in many different artists' works, even artists who were active before the, say, information age revolution. It's a space which I am calling, and I don't want anyone out there to steal it. I'm determined to do a show
called
Hyperspace, and if I do it, you're going to have to be in this show. Yeah. Because it's a wholly new sense of space, just as Jackson Pollock with the drip paintings created a new space. The biggest cultural change of our period has been the information age. And we literally don't see the world as we saw it before then. And it gives rise in art to this kind of, there's a sense of relief, of flatness, but you really can't pin it down. It's like when you're going through a computer screen, and if you could see the next slide, it will be interesting.
Yeah, the details of the work, yeah. These are the details.
Yes, these details. I know, because I went to your studio and kept my eyes open, I know how you painted, or at least I got a good sense of what you painted with. But people in the audience may not know this. You don't just use brushes, do you?
No. I mean, so the beginning of the painting, it goes from white canvas to a sort of like all over composition, like a Pollock kind of painting right from, you know, right at the beginning stage. So from white canvas to that. And then from there, it sort of becomes like a dialogue with whatever I've created, you know, this monster I've created that I have to deal with for the next month or two. And then I start to, so, you know, like you were saying, like there's adding and subtracting and using brushes, using rags, using sticks, using whatever I could find. I have 2 young daughters, and like they, you know, they bring me random stuff these days to like use. So that's pretty helpful. So,
Yeah, no, I get it.
Yeah.
Um,
But whatever, you know, whatever is at hand that could be used to get the effect that I want, I'll use it.
yeah, I seem to remember even
Except assistance.
something like a broom.
Huh?
Something like a broom. One of the things in your studio was almost like a broom. It wasn't just a broad brush. It was almost like a, you know, something to sweep up with almost. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah. Titian used to use a broom.
Fascinating. Let's have a look at the next slide, because we've got, if memory serves, 31 of them. And
These are all details of the triptych.
yes. Yes, now this is very important. It's important because of, to me, 2 particular aspects. The first is the title. And I'm always saying to people now that literacy is a dying art, and it's hard enough to talk proper British English, let alone American English. And if it comes to Latin, in medias res, it translates as in the middle of things, or if you like, in the midst of all that. And I think it's a great title, because all of your works, the paintings and the works on paper, they're always in a state of becoming. You know, there's this ancient philosophical distinction going way back beyond Plato to the pre-Socratics. There's 2 ways of looking at all reality. One is that, in a sense, it's static, and things are as you see them at the moment. And the second is that all things are in change, like Heraclitus, constant flow and flux. And in media res, it hits a nail on the head as to how your paintings are incredibly metamorphic. Some of the shapes obviously start to become figures, or at least humanoid type things, but look at the top area. And this is the other point I want to make. You believe a lot in synesthesia, and that's basically like, say, you see a color and you hear a sound. This goes way back to Kandinsky and the beginnings of abstract art. In your works, and I know music means a lot to you, but in your works, in my opinion, especially when we get up to the top, you see these areas at the top,
Mm-hmm.
what I describe it as is visual onomatopoeia. Are you with me? Onomatopoeia is when a word imitates a sound, like meow for a cat, boom for a bang, you see. But what you've done is you've translated that into paint. And again, it sees these gestural marks, which to me give this explosive effect to your paintings, as of something, because you're literally looking at an explosion, which, like any explosion, you know, all those Hollywood films with their burning helicopters and all that, you've got on the one hand bits you can make out, and on the other hand you've got this flux and everything going all over the place, and it's that equilibrium which makes paintings very hypnotic to me anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the challenge in the studio when you're making the painting is always to try to get rid of your rational side of thinking, because that side is the side that like stops you from going to a place where you're able to create what you're saying, like, you know, the bang, instead of thinking about the actual word, while I'm working, I'm thinking about those sounds and how the what's the word? How like the whole composition of the sounds are like sort of building on top of each other to leading to that point. So like you have all these notes of sounds everywhere, and then you have the whole composition of sounds sort of coming together, all these different layers, and you're just trying to get rid of the rational thinking side and pushing it towards like a visual thinking side, which is very different, which is in the same place as music is. And that's when I'm able to actually create works without thinking what's going to go where. You kind of see the next move while you're like working. So you just like, you put something down and then you see the next thing that should go there, and then you go after that. And that's because I'm just thinking in sounds to create the composition.
It sounds very like Pollock, but also another artist whom I know you admire, de Kooning.
Yes.
And de Kooning, you get this brushstroke of almost what the surrealists called psychic automatism, you know, free associations. As a brush stroke will turn into a figure, and then the next minute, you know, the breast or an eye or a mouth or a leg will turn back into paint. And, you know, it was de Kooning who said flesh was the reason why all painting was invented. And I like these pinky colors. There's something very
I gotta say that, so what we just talked about, that's every day that I come into the studio, I could think differently. So one day I come in and that's how I'm thinking. The next day I come in, I'm thinking like a miniaturist. So I'm not thinking about this overall sort of composition, but I'm thinking about details. I'm thinking very rational. I'm thinking about what does it mean? I'm sitting there and looking at the painting and developing these figures. So every day that I come in, or within one day, I could go through all these different personas, different ways of thinking, you know? So I could think like, maybe I want to build worlds like Bosch and Bruegel, like that's where the direction is going. And then the next day it could be like you're thinking about the overall composition, like de Kooning or Lee Krasner, who actually like better than Pollock. So it's like you go through these different modes every day. Like so the end result of the painting, when I look at it, I could see how I went through this sort of I don't know, like a time machine where I went to different places every day and I came back with something else.
So it's a kind of 1001 Nights in a way. It's Persian carpet, taking you way back to, well, Persian carpets themselves, which are amazing things of the 16th century, you know, but also through that to the old masters. And I'm very glad you brought up Bosch. It's actually, everyone should know, it's not pronounced Bosch. It's pronounced Bos in Flemish. But if I say Bos, no one will know what I'm talking about. They think I'm in the head of a company or something. Bos and Bruegel is also pronounced Bruegel in Flemish. But Bos, Bosch and Bruegel, they're the artists who really have this eye in the sky view, you know, very high sort of aerial viewpoint, looking down on humanity, like Bruegel's Triumph of Death in the Prado in Madrid. You get this sense of the word, and it was coined by Shakespeare, multitudinous. It's first used in Shakespeare's Macbeth, the multitudinous seas incarnate. And this sense of a multitudinous is very much a feeling of an eye in the sky, looking down upon debacle, the folly of everything that's going on is also conspiratorial quality. You seem to get the sense if you look at this work, and let's see the next one. Yes, this is fascinating, as if, yes, that one's good. We could even go on to the next.
What's
And then
that?
well, there you see this figure, you know, there seems to be these figures consorting together. And although I know there's no direct influence, I'm very much reminded of another ABEX, as I call it, abstract expressionist artist, the late Augustine, and where
Yes,
there's this balance between politics and paint.
but you see that figure who's painting, right?
Yeah, exactly. But what about these flecks and dots of orange? Are they a reference to cyberspace and pixels?
Yeah, that, and also at the same time, again, sounds for me, like notes of sounds, but also pixels and dots. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I get it. Let's have a look at the next one too. Here we go. See, we work in shadows, and that's it's impossible here not to think of a way in which, in the cyberspatial era of the last, what is that, I don't know, 25 odd years, the sense of a composed self has disappeared because we're all sorts of different things at once. You could be somebody on Facebook, you could be some different character, a different persona on Instagram. And this is what I mean about space of hyperlinks. And of course, it manifests itself in the kind of science fiction films we've seen in the last couple of decades, where things are constantly morphing, where you're not sure what's going on, but there's a sense of ominous activity. Is that something you feel when you're doing the paintings, or even better, put it this way, since you can't separate art and life, is that how you feel about the world today?
I think I've always felt like that about the world, you know? I think I've always had this sort of outsider looking at humanity as if like I was like I mean, I read something that was quite interesting in reference to Bach, where it says the images behave as if they were a product and instruments of an alien power, observing humans and making notes. And I feel like that's exactly has been my role. That's the way I view the world. That's why I relate to Bosch and Bruegel, because I feel like I understand that way of sort of being a social critic of humanity and just sort of seeing it from like a macro level and making notes and observations about the behavior. And as far as like you referring to them morphing into other things, yes, like this idea of like hybrid, where you could be part human, part animal. I mean, that's so ancient. That's such an ancient symbolic thing. But at the same time, I'm thinking about part also futuristic, part robot. So they could be ancient, contemporary, and futuristic at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, it's as contemporary as The Matrix or David Cronenberg's films, but it's at least as old as the medieval bestiaries. You know, what was going on in the margins of medieval manuscripts. There's a good book on that by Michael Camille called Image on the Edge. The manuscripts themselves, you know, they're straightforward writing, but all sorts of daring-do and antics and dark things are happening with the little animals on the sides and the edges. And that, of course, segues straight into Hier van Bosch and Bruegel, where you've got the zoomorphic, you've got the organic, you've got the almost crystalline effects of, you know, Bosch's alchemical shapes, you know, they're almost like buildings and things like that. And it's an amazing melange. It would be tempting for a naive viewer, and let's have another slide. I'm keeping my eye on the clock and the number of slides we've got, please. Interesting. Oh, yeah, because I haven't got all these in my head. It's coming up almost like a chain of associations with you yourself, working, you know, the wretched of the earth. Now, everybody knows what that title refers to. It's a great West Indian political philosopher, Frantz Fanon, isn't it? Yes, right. Right, it's a reference to Fanon. But on the other hand, I'm looking at something that's very sort of Max Ernst-like, you know, migrating figures, you know, we're in an age of mass migration, turmoil, instability. And there's something I want to say. It's obvious to me, at least, in my personal view, that you do deal with political issues, but you're not a political artist. Does that make sense to you?
That makes sense, because then you make it eternal. Like it becomes an eternal issue that, just like going back to Bosch and Bruegel, you know, they didn't get too specific, but like I could look at those works and I could kind of think about those in our contemporary world and kind of project it on the issues we're having. And I'm kind of interested in that, where, you know, there's a local issue and I want to like know about that issue and I want to deal with that issue, but I want to show it on a bigger scale. If that makes sense.
I get it. Looking back at the history of art, you know, there's artists who are very definitely political artists. You know, we think if you call them artists, like a British satir, artists of the 18th century, Rowlandson and Gilray and all that, and now more recently William Gropper, American 1930s, and George Gross, you know, they're very political artists. But then there's others where they may be dealing with political things. I mean, a lot of, you know, Renaissance art is propaganda, like Holbein's portrait of Henry VIII, you know, with a codpiece stuck out here and a swaggering pose, you know. It's political propaganda, but it's not a political painting, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Exactly. Goya's up to his neck in politics, but at the end of the day, you feel that he's really dealing with the human condition through paint.
Exactly. He's one of my favorites also, as you know.
The world upside down. Well, things were bad before the COVID-19 crisis, but now our world's getting turned upside down every day. And
things have been bad since 2016, but yeah, they got worse.
Good, let's have another one. I'm thinking about each work as it comes up, so this is a kind of conversation with a lecture, or a lecture with images. Here we come to ordered disorders. Again, is this visual onomatopoeia, as these exploding points. And the colors, you know, we talked about this, and I know you don't see any affinity with the German artist Jonas Bergert. He's representational, and you're very much more in a kind of how should we say, an interface between the representational and the abstract. But his colors are very interesting. There's a lot of toxic colors in his works. Yours are not so much toxic, but they have a very calculated artificiality.
Mm-hmm.
And you're a gifted colorist, there's no question about that. But there's slightly artificial quality. It reminds me of the heraldic quality, which you see in Renaissance art. And you see it over and again in Bruegel and Boss. You know, certain types of clothing and things like that. Is that something that's in your mind when you do it?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want him to have like a hallucinogenic quality, you know, where, or like when you go to a park after it's rained and everything is like breathing, everything is like alive and the colors are alive. I feel like I always want to have that kind of a feeling where the colors are sort of breathing.
And somewhere along the line, I think you said something about, in a literature, I can't remember, but a painting having a life of its own. And it's impossible, if I'm right, if memory serves, it's impossible again not to think back to Pollock, where he makes his famous statement about painting having a life of its own. And this is closer up.
Yeah.
What are we to make of these horizontal striations? Is there an element of geometry in there?
Again, it's like a couple of things. I think one way was to sort of push the, like figuring out a way to like push the figures forward. So that was one thing. And then, I don't know, to me, it has this sort of vibration, and maybe it's something that I just, you know, some things you just pick up as you're like walking around. And I think where I live in Brooklyn, like there's a lot of like warehouses where they have these garages and they have, you know, like so I see like, you know, I'll take picture of my daughter standing in front of it, or seeing people walk by. And I always felt like there was this sort of like something interesting happening, you know, some kind of vibration, or some kind of like a movement happening with those horizontal lines in front of these shutters that just seemed interesting to me. And I thought, I'll take it. I'll try that.
Yeah, it's a visual melange, I can see that. And it reminds me of what de Kooning famously said, content is a glimpse.
Yes.
It's very small, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Order disorders again.
Yeah.
There's coming up here, and it runs, I think, throughout your work, something that has fascinated me for quite a long time. It actually got me thinking first when I looked at Rothko, and there's nothing to do with Rothko here at all, but it's the blur. You see again and again your lineation, your outlines become etherized into a kind of blur. You see the central area here? You think you can grasp the shape. You think something's actually taking form amidst the phantasmagoria, and then it goes into a blur. Let's have a look at the next one. Yes, you see again and again, there's this is very fascinating blurring. And it's a blur which is the bridge that mediates between abstraction and representation in your work. There we go. You see how this has become a blur? There's almost phantasmagorical phantom face here. And
yeah,
the point about the blur is just it mediates between two things. On the one hand, the blur, it has a lot to do with formlessness, because the original meaning of one of the dictionary meanings of blur was smear. I looked it up in the OED. And there's a lot of smeared effects in your work, as if something was there and then it started to be almost erased. And then on the other hand, you've got the gesture, the formless on the one, gesture on the other. And gesture is something that's very, very kinetic, and it's very, very deliberate. And I see this interaction going throughout your work, and that's how I see the blur as crucial. Maybe you see it a different way. I mean, do you start off with something that's quite precise and recognizable and then start to camouflage it almost? No?
No, it's the other way around. It starts very abstract, and then slowly, like, I start to see within the fragmentations that I've created, and those fragmentations start to kind of communicate with each other as if they want to become a figure or something. And then I see those possibilities. And then it becomes a game of taming, you know? It becomes a game of like trying to figure out, should this become a figure or should it go away? Should I erase this? Should this come out? And you know, the way I know that something really wants to come out is, again, going back to the whole sound thing, where a figure, I'll start hearing it breathing and moving and walking. So like, then I'll know that this figure really needs to come out, and then the other figure, which is not communicating to me, that just needs to go away. So it becomes this really intense kind of like dialogue with the work that makes me make the choice of bringing out a figure. But that doesn't mean that figure is going to stay. I might work on it and then it might become something else completely. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, creating and then destroying, and then creating and then destroying it again. And the end result ends up being, you know, a lot of creation, a lot of destruction, a lot of adding, a lot of subtracting, a lot of chance, and then you have something, which is something I could never make again because of that reason, because you've taken so many roads to get to where you are with that figure.
What you're saying is absolutely brilliant, because it exactly meshes with the title of the last work we saw, which I don't know if you're even looking at it. I'm too busy talking, but it was called The Builder. And of course, pictorial architectonics is exactly what you're talking about. And building, you can only have building when you have destruction, because you start from scratch. You have to, you know, dig up the ground. It's de Kooning's excavation, you know. It's like Manhattan Island itself. It's like this bloody city London, where every other road or street is being either built up or knocked down, and that's an analog, I think, to, well, not just the state of the world out there, but also to how paintings accumulate and then dissipate again. It's an organic process. And I'm thinking of Yeats here, W.B. Yeats. For love has pitched its house in a place of excrement, and nothing can be sound or whole that has not first been rent. You see, it's the tearing apart and the putting back together, and it's an organic process. Thought Police is another provocative title. Body invasion, that's another thing. And these persistent horizontal divisions are usually a brighter top and a much more tangled bottom. I should say lower area. It's, put it very crudely, it's kind of heaven and hell. Do you see it that way? You know, there's all that going on up in the sky, celestial, and then there's this conjures this whole melange of human folly, or to put it in paint terms, abstract and figurative, all mixed up down below.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for me, it's the bottom is always like the heavy side of things, where there's conflict, these figures are dwelling at the bottom, and the top is maybe the more hopeful part of the painting, where things are transforming into ether or freeing themselves from this chaos at the bottom.
Right. So it's not a Rothko thing for sure, because, you know, Rothko, with those tiers and the 4 tiers, have become a classic format. Oh, and this coiling, I love this, because this coiled snake. Well, I'm calling it a snake in the lower right, but it's exactly, I'm going to be an art historian for a very brief moment, and I'm going to sound stuffy, but this coiling around an upright thing is exactly what you see in the leftward panel of Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. Now, I'm probably being a thought policeman. I'm putting ideas into your head. But but I don't know, that's a very, very Hieronymus Bosch detail. But maybe, you know, I think what I like about your whole vision when we first met is it's very all-inclusive. And you've got some painters who, you know, it's like a Mondrian or Vermeer, it's the same thing, it's the same milkmaid, it's the same window, it's the same rectangles, the same verticals. But then you've got the other artists who are like the world itself. You know, Sibelius met Mahler. Well, I don't think he did meet Mahler. And Sibelius said he wanted to serve up a glass of cold water, not cocktails. But Mahler retorted, well, music has to be like the whole world itself, you see. And I think you're in the second camp.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
I like that. I like all-inclusive artists. And then, you know, you've got an eye. You can look back, you can look forward, and you can also, above all, you can look at how you are in the midst, in medias res, and that's the process of your paintings. Did you study a lot about history, or did it come naturally?
I did study a lot of art history. I mean, I'm still studying art history, I think. But, you know, it's like you go to the Met and you go from one wing to another wing to another wing, and then you make connections between things that have nothing to do with each other. So like I study art history in that way, where maybe it's like a disruptive art history, where you want to connect things together that shouldn't go together somehow.
Yes, and this reminds me of something else, and I think it was Ernst Gombrich, a great art historian. You know, he wrote a story of art, and he actually, I think it was him, and I've believed it myself anyway, that it's true that art obviously relates to the world because we're living beings in a world, you know. But we must never forget that most art is built out of other art.
Oh, absolutely.
And consciously or not, it's got its own story. Just like a Met, you know, you'll go from one room to another, one wing to another, ancient to modern. And it's art that gives birth to art. And that's why I like all-inclusive artists, because they then fit into this ongoing narrative, which is very, very rich. Could we have another slide, please? Hello? Yeah. Tell us about this, because you were very naughty when we were scrambling to get all these images together in the last 48 hours with endless backings and forthings and goodness knows what, and emails popping up all the time. You said at the last minute, and this is what life is like now. You know, there's a book by Jonathan Crary called 724, and basically it's, I can't stand it anymore. You know, it's a phone, it's the emails, it's this link, it's that link, it's Zoom, it's Google Hangouts and all that. I mean, for God's sake, you know, just to stop for a moment. But you popped this one in, Red, the Plague, and I know why you did it, because you want to be up to a minute, and I think that's very sensible. Can you tell us something about it?
Well, it's funny you say up to a minute, because I finished this painting at the end of January, and I didn't know what it was about, as you sometimes, I don't know what the work is about till a little bit later. And then it was in the studio for a little bit, and that's when, you know, the pandemic was happening in the midst of it. And then I start to realize that, oh yes, of course, that's what it was about. Like it's, and I believe in this thing where, you know, like Henri Bergson says that like we're like antennas, and we're sort of like catching consciousness with our antennas. Things are in the air, and maybe you're if you're like sensitive to it and receptive to it, maybe you'll catch it before someone else does, or you're able to interpret it early on. So I realized that this was, without me knowing, about this whole situation. I mean, you have like the red sky, and you have like the blue sun, which when there's a blue sun, you know something is wrong. And you have all these like symbolic things in there that, to me, it just made so much sense that that's what it was about. And at the same time, Paul Kasman, rest in peace, had given me a book for Christmas which is A Month in Siena by Hisham Matar. It's the most, it's an amazing book, but there's a chapter in there that's called, what is it called? It's called like something about believe in faith or something like this. I can't remember the name of the chapter, but it was all about, it's all about the Black Death. And I'm like reading this, and it was like, it's like one of those things where somehow everything just kind of comes together, like time. You picked up the book at a right time, and the painting and everything just kind of like comes together like that. So I
Well,
think,
it's remarkably prophetic because, in a way, going back to the plague. If you said you did the plague in January, that was before COVID-19 really got going, wasn't it?
yeah, like, I mean, here it was like in March where
Exactly.
we were, yeah.
And it reminds me of what there was a jingle of my parents' generation, people of a certain age, and my mother used to say to me, "You're a prophet and you don't know it." You see, and the artist kind of prophet. And here we come to Trust in the Future, and it's a brilliant title because it almost brings a wheel full circle. And we're in media res, we're in the middle of things. You, as an artist, you look back to the past, to the Flemish old masters. You're also very, very attuned and savvy about what's going on now. And the question is, should we trust in the future? And it's a brilliant title, but it's also a fascinating monochrome painting. Do you decide early on which paintings are going to be monochrome and which will have a full color palette?
No, I don't. I mean, this could have started this color and went towards color. It's just a matter of like, sort of like listening to the painting and following where it wants to go. In this case, this painting was the first one that I actually, it's like, now I have like certain colors that I make myself that it triggers memory, place, smell for me. Like it becomes like a personalized color. And this was like the first painting that I made that I made that color blue and used it for this. And I just didn't think it needed anything else after I'd made it. And to go back to your question about trust in the future, I mean, do we have a choice? I don't think we have a choice.
Well, it's a touch of T.S. Eliot. 4 quartets, time past and time future, perhaps both contained in time present. And if all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. That's the last major work, 4 quartets that Eliot did. And at the end of the day, art is, at its best, is a meditation on time, because
and a gesture of hope.
yes, and proverbially, to go back to Latin, ars longa, vita brevis, art is long, time is short. We have a finite time here on Earth, on this planet. And it's very thought-provoking. Can we have a last two? Hello, Ali. I'm not sure if the audience is seeing what you're seeing. I'm seeing you head on. I'm not seeing the slides. Could we just get through to the last 2 slides? I'm keeping an eye on the clock. Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we are at the top of the hour, so if you want to just wrap up when you feel is natural, then we can move
I'm
to
going to cut it off
question.
very soon. I'm going to shut up. But I want to ask Ali, Pollock, I think de Kooning, Bosch, Bruegel, and all that, but what about Pollock?
Yeah, Pollock, I'm reading this book, The 9th Street Woman. It's a really good book. Is that what it's called? Yeah, I think that's what it's called. And they, Hans Hofmann was the teacher of Lee Krasner, and then later Pollock. And somebody asks him, so Pollock is your student? And he says, no, Pollock is the student of my student. which is Lee Krasner. So in other words, like, I think I respond to Lee Krasner more than Pollock, because I feel like although Pollock took things to where he took it to, I feel like, I mean, maybe this is up for debate, but I don't think he could have overcome this period after that. I mean, if he hadn't died and continued, where I feel like with Lee Krasner, she actually became better and better and better and better.
She was terrific. She was terrific because it makes me think, before we go into a very last image, but a couple of years back, there was a tremendous show of Lee Krasner umber paintings at Casmin Gallery in New York. And it was dramatic, and it showed, I thought, the peak of Krasner's achievement. You know, the umber paintings gave Pollock a run for his money, and then a lot more, I think, you know, so she was fantastic. But she only really came out of a shell after Pollock had had his car crash. Last slides, please. Yeah. Takes us back to Boss and the Garden of Earthly Delights. If you look very, very carefully on the leftward panel, you know, it's supposed to be a sort of paradise thing, but there's a snake flying around the tree. You can't see it now, but you'll see it in a good art history book. And I'm not plugging a publisher, but you would never believe this. I actually commissioned this book.
You did?
I worked for Fiden for almost 20 years, so I do know my boss. And it's you know, this is the theatre of the world. See, one of the things you've taken from Boss and Bruegel is the aerial viewpoint, the sense that there's a heck of a lot going on down there. But in a way, the artist is like a kind of eye in the sky. Is that how you want to see yourself?
Eye in the sky, yeah, for sure. It's like you're basically showing to humanity, like, this is who we are from a distance, without without getting into too much details in a micro level. You pull yourself back in a macro level, and you sort of show humanity from like a larger perspective, that it's the same. Like, when you look at this Bosch painting, it's like we're doing that right now. I mean, it's not like it's stuck in time. It's contemporary.
Well, nothing could be more relevant than Bosch now, because Bosch actually painted his works around, this work, The Garden of Earthly Delights, around the turn of the 15th to 16th century, around 1500. And no one's ever decided on the exact meaning of Bosch's works. And ambiguity is everything. There's been zillions of interpretations, but all these art historians, they've all had different ideas. But this ambiguity.
Well, it's like poetry, right? Like, poetry keeps its own secret even when it reveals itself.
Perfect. Perfect, because ambiguity is built into poetry, because words slip, slide, change, have different meanings. And I'm going to end up by saying that if Nick Bennett is still there, he's going to read us a poem, which I think I quoted in my essay on your 2008 show. And it's a poem by, well, not my show, Blaine Summons' show, 2018, sorry, time past and time present, getting a bit confused at the end of this now. But in the 2018 essay, I think I quoted Yeats, and the poem is The Second Coming. And there's something about, there's something about that poem which is incredibly relevant. And again, it's prophetic. What people don't often know is that that poem was in part a response to the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918-19. And what that poem does is what all great art should do in the end, is it transforms a horror of life. And let's face it, human history, as Hegel famously said, is a slaughter bench. there's more blood and guts in human history than there is joy and happiness. But what art does, as I see it, and what I think you do in your art, like any really good artist, is you transform that into something which is alive and which, in a sense, refreshes us. And it transforms a horror, well, basically into something that, even if it's terrible to look at, you get something out of. It's like Goya. Goya stares down the horror. So up comes, I'm going to shut up now. I don't know if you've got anything else to say, Ali.
I was going to say his wife, who was pregnant, had the virus.
Exactly. It's amazing. It's amazingly topical.
But she lived. But I guess during the Spanish flu, the pregnant women were the target, right? Like, I mean, they were the ones more susceptible to getting it.
Yeah.
So it's probably going through.
Well, it's like history going around in circles, and that's what
Yep.
Yeats believed in. And I'm going to let Nick. Yeah, exactly.
I think they're going to do Q&A first, no?
Yeah, so I think now is a good time to open up for some questions from the audience. We have a lot of great questions, and we will end with the poem read by Nick. Our first question comes from Laura. Laura, I will unmute you now so you can voice your question. Laura, are you there?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Laura, hey.
Hey,
How
just
are
a
you?
second, I have to look my question now. No, I was actually making a reference when you zoom your paintings, when you have a zoom, it looks like for me that you can make almost like a different painting, you know, from a small version of a painting. So it's like, looks like there is a lot of small mini paintings into one painting. So this is something that I was actually, that you realize really when you really zoom in the thing that you cannot see, sometimes you cannot see really in a normal, like, you know, normal thing when you watch the painting from a distance. So this is something that I found very interesting. And I was like wondering, like, it's kind of curatorial thought, like, you know, when you, it will be so interesting for me to see a lot of zooms of your paintings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that always, that's why like reproduction of my work is always like an issue, because like, you know, if people don't know my work, they don't realize that there's stuff that are like small, like really tiny in the paintings, figurative stuff, all the way to like large stuff. And that's the way I work in the studio. Like when I'm working, I'm working in a miniature mode, very close. And I'm also working from like 23 feet away, where I'm looking at the painting and imagining the larger shapes. What do they mean? And as you get closer, I love this sort of macro and micro way of looking at the painting as you sort of shift around the space and get close to it and get far. And I do have like a photo album in my computer of all the details of my work. And you're right, like each one could be like its own world, its own painting. And the thing is that those figures, most of the time in the paintings, they're not really like aware of each other. They're sort of in their own world. You know?
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it, but it's good to know that you have all those details separately in the computer. By the way, David, wonderful talk. I mean, guys, I enjoy so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Our next question comes from Natalie. Natalie, I will unmute you now.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk and sharing your work with us. My question was, I really connected with what you were saying about like sort of being an outsider, taking like notes about humanity. And it's really apparent how that translates into your compositions, but I was wondering how that translates into your mark making and into the decisions you make on like, in all the like details.
Yeah, I mean, the word I really like is infinite variety when it comes to art. I hear myself echoing. Do you guys hear that too? It's just me. Oh, okay, now it's better. Infinite variety, because as I'm working, I go through like I was saying earlier, I go through like many different ways of technically dealing with the work. So the marks, like I never liked the idea of having like a particular kind of mark that you'll just like, you know, like that's why I don't really like impressionists other than Van Gogh, because I feel like the mark is so mechanical and it's like the same mark. And I've always wanted to have, well, not that consciously I wanted to have marks, but like that's just like my nature. The way I think is that when I'm working different days, I'll have different modes of working, like different energy and different way of making marks or notes or descriptive things or bringing something out in a miniature way. So I think at the end, and at the end, when you look at the painting, I like for the viewer to be able to see all these different layers, all these different histories of me going through these different stages of making the work. Like I like you to see the construction of the work. I don't want to hide it, like, you know, like under a layer, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love what you're saying about having the history in the layers. I think that's like, I was trying to like uncover like, how did he do that? Like what was the order in that, and like all of that.
I don't even know the order because there's adding and subtracting and accidents and stripping and going back. Then when you look at the surface, like you don't know what's on top of what and what came first and what came, you know? So when I look at my older paintings, it's really hard for me to think about how I made them, because I don't know, you made so many choices and so many things happened to make that work. It wasn't planned.
Yeah.
I never planned the work and I don't have references. So I just sort of dive in and, you know, dive into the abyss, and whatever happens, I go with it. Or take it there. It's a dance, really.
I have one quick question, if I can, if I'm allowed to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just very quick. You use linen and not canvas, and why do you do that?
Well, because canvas is very mechanical, and because I get really close to the painting, I notice that difference, that the canvas is very mechanical and linen is, again, what I like, which is infinite variety. Like you don't know, as far as the texture goes, what you're going to get, because it's more organic, more natural, whatever. And I also, over time, trying so many different ways of, like, you know, technically priming a canvas versus a linen and all this, like I came to a point where I knew exactly what works for me. So
Got it.
linen is it. And it's Belgium, so.
Ah, that's what Pollock used for his biggest painting, mural. Peggy Guggenheim bought him the Belgian linen.
Yep.
And the firm still exists. It's called Claessens.
Oh, yeah.
You can't do better than that.
Okay, our next question comes from our publisher, Fong Bui. Fong, if you would like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, Ali, for a very thoughtful conversation. I learned a lot, even though I've written and certainly thought of the work of Ali for a long time. But I have a question in reference to your reference to Shakespeare, David, in terms of multitude, the idea of multitude, which remind me of Hamlet. When King Claudius appeared, he say, I had sent to seek him to find a body he loved of the distracted multitude, which then I recently thought of a very famous, of course, democratic vista by Walt Whitman, where he say, I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I'm large and I contain multitudes. And it's very interesting because where we are now in this time, where the pressure to conform into conservatism and a certain tendency towards nationalism is so intensified. And Ali and myself being immigrants, so we're very sensitive about this issue. And I recently went back and reread in 3 hours straight of Horace Kellan, very famous essay he wrote, published in The Nation around 1915. Can't remember the issue. I think it's February issue. It's called Democracy versus the Melting Pot. He was trying to argue the right to be different. And he taught about the symphony, the idea of symphony, where America should not try to become homogeneous, singing in unison. Rather, it should be like a multiplicity of unity, like a symphony, where all the instruments should be encouraged to sound its musical uniqueness. And yet, it adds to the symphony of the whole, symphonically speaking. So my question is very simple, Ali. I wonder whether the tendency to appeal to correspond to overallness, whether Pollock or wherever the other references that they were mentioning earlier, was that whole subconscious desire to the multitude, to be more or less accepted everything rather than making hierarchy.
Well, I mean, I could compare Pollock and Lee Krasner and de Kooning to Bosch and Bruegel because of that reason, because not having a center, having this sort of all over composition where each part of the painting, each figure that you put in there, each animal, tree, whatever, is as important than there's no hierarchy. And I don't, and I think that that's always interesting to me, to be able to, for the eyes to be able to move in the painting and not find like a hierarchical kind of figure, to be able to like, everybody's the same, everybody's sharing this energy in the painting. And energy is another word that comes to mind for me when I think about that kind of work. This energy that's explosive, like a big bang or something, where it just like opens up, and it's like, and we're all like fragments of it. We're all like shattered pieces of it.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, pictorially, I can understand, because people have been, as we study art history, we understand why there's certain easy matching, whether it's cubism, referencing theory of relativity of Einstein, or whether, Pollock being reference to theory of Heisenberg, as he say, I would like to make painting that reference to atomic bomb. So I understand that matching, but I'm talking about more like you yourself as an immigrant, you know what I mean? Coming to New York, trying to reference or relate to those all over space. It gotta be more than just pictorially attraction to it. Do you know what I mean? I mean, there are references to Persian literature, to poetry. I understand that you relate to urns, for example. I mean, by the way, David, his retrospective was 2005. I was there at the beginning of the opening, so I spoke to the curator, Sabine Reward. But similarly with Ernst's output, I mean, he undertake mythology as much as Freudian theory and literature and science and poetry and whatnot. So my question is just very more specific about how you feel as an immigrant, be an artist, and whether that's something that relate to your attraction to it, to the multitude of space, as David said earlier.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I guess I always felt like I was interested in different cultures and multiplicity from when I was young. When I was young, I would read the Tintin books, and in each book, he's going to a different part of the world, different culture, and I was sort of like traveling through these books and learning about different cultures, mythologies, religions, symbolism. So I feel like I've always been interested in this sort of looking at from a bigger perspective and multiplicity. And, you know, we live in Brooklyn, where multiplicity is probably more than anywhere else. And I feel at home here in New York more than I did in Iran, more than I did in California because of that reason. Because I feel like you don't question those things, you know, you get around with your friends, and if you really think about it, you're like, wow, he's from Vietnam, he's from, you know, like you, but you don't even think about it because
Yes.
it doesn't even matter, you know. So I think I feel at home and I feel comfortable in a place like this because of that reason, because of that multiplicity. And just a note, I don't know if you know, but like I curated a show called We Contain Multitudes.
Oh, I see.
In India.
Okay, thank you, Ali.
Okay.
Answered well.
Thank you so much, Ali and David. Do you have any last closing remarks before we move to Nick to read our poem today?
The only thing I've got to say is that I know that poem from heart, by heart. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, and Nick is going to do it better because he's got the whole.
Do it all, David. Come on. Do the.
Yeah, go for it.
Come back on.
We could imagine with, you know, Yeats with your accent more.
Oh, that's the opening. No, Nick's got to do it. I've got it here if I want to look at it. All right, if you really want me to, and I don't want to do Nick out of a role. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. The blood-dimmed mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of a desert, a shape with lion's body and head of a man is moving, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep will vex to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. I could have done that in a booklet accent, but this is more BBC.
Thank you.
But I think it's Ali. We are very grateful to Ali for everything he's done for us.
Thank you, David and Ali.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Brooklyn Rel and Fong and everybody.
Thank you,
Thank
Ali.
you. Thank you, Fong. Thank you very much. I thought it was going to be hard work, but I've actually enjoyed this.
That's good. Thank you so much, David and Ali, for coming today. It was a great conversation. I want to remind people that tomorrow we have another social environment at the same time, 1 p.m., with Donatien Gros, with Nora Waddell, Catherine Malibu, Paul McCarthy, and they will be discussing the life of Pierre Guyotot tomorrow at 1 p.m. So thank you all for coming, and please join us tomorrow. And feel free to unmute yourselves as you say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. David, read so much more beautifully than I ever could have.
Thank
This is
you.
wonderful.
Beautiful poem.
Thank you,
Hi,
Billy.
Rachel.
Thank you, Ali.
Wonderful
Hi.
poem.
Yeah, forgive me for doing
Keep
that.
up. I know.